Good morning, Taran. Good morning, Shalvi. Good morning, everyone. Very warm greetings of the day to you all. So, we shall be discussing about the relevance of the Geneva Convention in the background of the Russia-Ukraine war. Okay, and by this we'll come to know many things about the Geneva Convention. Okay, so we have today, like, how many people have joined so far? Taran, Shalvi, Nikhil, Soumya, Zinya, and many others. Okay, very warm good morning to all of you. So, this is something, Geneva Convention is something from the year 1949, which holds relevance since the day it has come into force. It has been signed and implemented by various nations at the international fora. It holds a good position, a good place in the eyes of the nation states. But since every priceless thing and every good thing seems to have lost its importance and worth in the third decade of the 21st century, same goes with the Geneva Convention as well. That Geneva Convention is something which has lost its relevance. Today, if the new disordered world, or when we can say that when the world is plunging into another third world war in 2022, or in the third decade of the 2022, this seems like as if all the conventions of the United Nations have been kept at bay. They have been shelved altogether, and no due heed is being paid to any of those international norms and conventions. So Geneva Convention can be well understood today in the background of the Russia-Ukraine war. This is from the international law, and since you people might have studied international law, and you must be reading this international law, so you would be having an idea that the subject of international law, it starts from this very debate whether international law can be categorized as a law, because this categorization of international law as a law would raises pertinent questions like sanction. This is the debate. There's a comparative analysis between the international law and the municipal law, and sanction is an important feature of any law. Since international law lacks this feature of sanction, it raises amongst jurists, it has raised and it raises amongst jurists a very pertinent question, that if international law lacks sanctions as a feature, then whether international law can be regarded as a law or not. Because when we see that conventions like Geneva Conventions and many other conventions like plethora of conventions and treaties are there, which have together made up international law. When we see these conventions being violated in the broad day sunshine by countries who cannot be brought to books, who cannot be bound to do anything, because every nation today happens to be a sovereign nation. Convention can put moral obligations upon the necks of these nation states, but still cannot compel these nation states to actually follow the principles of those conventions. This is because international law does not have any sanction. Okay. What like, for example, before we begin about the Geneva Convention, let us also talk about what China has been doing in South China Sea. Do you have any idea what China has been doing in the South China Sea? Is that China started its, it's like it started shadow boxing. A shadow boxing was started in the South China Sea when China started its illegal drilling of resources from the South China Sea from the areas which exclusively belong to countries like Vietnam, Brunei, Cambodia, Philippines, and others. Okay, from their exclusive areas and from the international waters also. You need to have, you are not supposed to drill the resources from the international waters also. But China said that I'm going to believe each one of you, because this whole South China Sea belongs to me, and I'm not going to stop my illegal activities. Okay, and I'm not going to stop my illegal activities. I'm going to acquire all the resources in the South China Sea. That's what I'm going to do. When all the countries like Brunei, Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, they together approached the International Court of Justice against China, China was like, an International Court of Justice ruled against China. This was on July 2012. This judgment was of the ICJ was out in July 2012, when International Court of Justice said that China is liable for all the damage it has caused to these nations in the to these countries in the South China Sea, and it must stop its illegal activities, illegal drillings and extraction of resources from the South China Sea immediately, right away. But the China said that I am openly denying to follow whatever has been commanded to me by the International Court of Justice. I'm not going to follow it. I'm not going to follow it. And because the ICJ could not stop China, because there are countries who are now violating international law, and they can violate international law with greater and greater impunity, because there is no fear of punishment, because actually the punishment does not exist. There is no sanction. Today you cannot send any ruler to jail properly. There have been so many serious violations of human rights in Nigeria in 2015. But whether the brutal dictator of Nigeria was ever brought to books? The question is that international law में कोई sanction नहीं है. Now, can you please shed some light on the Russia-Ukraine war? Yes, Prableen. As the Stark rightly said, international law is a weak law. Anybody who can shed some light on the Russia-Ukraine war? Okay, so Russia has attacked Ukraine, and it's a part of the larger game plan of the United States also. And because of the excessively Now, Nikhil says Russia have been found guilty by International Court of Justice and is told to stop the attack on Ukraine, but the order of ICJ is not being followed by Russia. Who follows the order of the ICJ? Nobody gives a damn to what ICJ says. Okay, that's the problem in international law. Russia has been trying to get control of the entire territory of Ukraine and oust the Zelensky government completely out of it, because they all are Zionist people, like the people in the Ukraine, and its president Zelensky they're Zionists. They belong to the liberal group. They wanted to join NATO, but NATO happens to be one of the biggest military bloc of the biggest rival military bloc of Russia. Okay, so it wanted that no, at least countries that are surrounding Russia should not be a part of NATO. And this cannot, NATO cannot be left to become an unruly horse in the world. Countries like United States, who started this military bloc called NATO along with so many other European nations, they have now become an unruly horse. They poke their nose into almost everything. They started policing in Afghanistan, and it was because of these excessive regressive policies of the United States that the Yemen was converted into wreckage and debris. What happened in Iraq? Iraq was badly bombed. There was a lot of hue and cry. Why countries like Syria, Yemen and Iran have been turned into wreckage and debris? It's all because of the United States policies. Russia started this very recently when it attacked the Ukraine. Okay. Now this Russian invasion, it's a typical one now, and this should be read in the light of the Geneva Convention. Now explain, what are the Geneva Convention guidelines during wartime? The story so far. Russia's armed invasion of Ukraine starting February 24. Yes, Zinia rightly says that international law is more based on mutual understanding between the nations. It's because of the mutual understanding between the nations. And mutual understanding, Zinia and all others, people, please listen to me very carefully. This mutual understanding is based on a very clear understanding. And that clear understanding is that if I am going to hit you, you are also going to hit me. Because if I am a nuclear power, you are also a nuclear power. What did India's nuclear doctrine say? What does India's nuclear doctrine says? After India conducted its second underground nuclear test on 11th May 1998 at Pokhran in Rajasthan during the Prime Ministership of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, after 16 days or 17 days, on 28th May 1998, the then Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee narrated India's nuclear doctrine on the floor of the House. And that nuclear doctrine contained that India is going to build credible minimum deterrent to deter its enemies from attacking us. To deter its enemies from attacking us. That means it is a kind of a mutual understanding between the nations that if I am going to hit you, I may also be attacked in retaliation. So countries are restraining themselves today, and they have until recently restrained themselves only because the other country happened to be equally powerful militarily and financially. So this is important. Nobody gives any due importance to the other nation. It's only because the countries have understood that there is no, there's nothing productive in indulging in any war. So what are the Geneva Convention guidelines during wartime? Naman Sharma says 12th time in the history of United Nations that the special emergency resolution was passed to stop Russian invasion. Okay. Yes, that's right. Now, what are the Geneva Conventions guidelines during wartime? The story so far. Russia's armed invasion of Ukraine starting February 24 has set off a steady escalation in the hostilities on Ukrainian soil. And in many cases, civilian infrastructure and non-combatants have been impacted. Civilian infrastructure, you must have seen the videos, and all the videos are not authentic. Please let me be very clear. All the videos are not authentic. Okay, you may see some photographs where civilian infrastructure has been damaged completely in Ukraine, and non-combatants have been impacted as the Russian military continues to sweep through the country, marching on to the capital, Kyiv, presumably in a bid to destabilize the seat of Ukrainian government. There's growing concern surrounding the issue of human rights violations. Russian President Vladimir Putin and his administration have steadfastly denied any responsibility of harm to civilians. However, as the evidence of casualties in the civilian population continues to mount, the world will increasingly look to the Geneva Conventions, a set of principles outlining norms for combatant behavior during a war, for standards to which the invading Russian forces can be held. Ultimately, if there is a compelling case for prosecuting combatants for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression, it is not inconceivable that evidence could be collected for an investigation and trial at the International Criminal Court. So, there is no denial of this fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine and is committing brutal atrocities on the land of Ukraine with the civilians and other people. There's no doubt about it. Okay. Now, all these evidences are proper in initiating an investigation and trial against the Russian forces and Russia for prosecuting combatants for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. It is not inconceivable that evidence would be collected for an investigation and trial at the International Criminal Court. Okay, now what are the Geneva Conventions guidelines during wartime? Now from this part we are starting the provisions of the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Conventions are a set of 4 treaties formalized in 1949 and 3 additional protocols, the first 2 of which were formalized in 1977 and the third in 2005, which codify widely accepted ethical and legal international standards for humanitarian treatment of those impacted by any ongoing war. So there are 4 treaties. Geneva Convention is a set of 4 treaties. We have to remember this. And they were formalized in 1949. And with this, along with these 4 treaties, there are 3 additional protocols. The first 2 of which were formalized in 1977 and the third in 2005, which codify widely accepted ethical and legal international standards for humanitarian treatment of those impacted by any ongoing war. Okay, the first 2 of the protocols, there are 3 additional protocols. The 2 of them, the first 2 protocols, they were formalized in 1977 and the third protocol was formalized in 2005. Okay, so you have to remember this. The first line is very important to understand the composition and the structure of the Geneva Convention. That the Geneva Convention is a set of 4 treaties formalized in 1949. All the 4 treaties were formalized in 1949. Along with this, there are 3 additional protocols. The first 2 of them were formalized in 1977 and the third was formalized in 2005. And they codify widely accepted ethical and legal international standards for humanitarian treatment of those impacted by any ongoing war. What do they contain? They contain the ethical and legal international standards for humanitarian treatment of those impacted by any ongoing war. Okay? International standards for humanitarian treatment of those impacted by any ongoing war. Okay? What are the duties of the belligerents? How they have to fight? What are the aids that should be right away, immediately extended to the civilians? How the civilians should be protected? What are the treatment of the POWs? Everything has been comprehensively and holistically dealt with by the Geneva Convention. The focus of the conventions is the treatment of non-combatants and prisoners of war, and not the use of conventional or biological and chemical weapons, the use of which is governed respectively by the Hague Convention and the Geneva Protocol. Okay, what is the focus of the convention? What is at the center of the convention? It is the treatment of the non-combatants and prisoners of war. How the non-combatants, the people who are not fighting, okay, the people who are not fighting, the non-combatants and the prisoners of war, all the armed force personnel who have been arrested by the enemy country, the POWs. It talks about this. The focus of the convention is the treatment of non-combatants and POWs. Okay, and not the use of conventional and or biological and chemical weapons. And the convention does not deal with how the conventional biological or chemical weapons are supposed to be used, the use of which is governed respectively by the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Protocol. Okay, the first Geneva Convention protects wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. The first Geneva Convention protects wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. This convention extends to medical and religious personnel, medical units, and medical transport. While recognizing distinctive emblems of these organizations, the convention has two annexes containing a draft agreement relating to hospital zones and model identity cards for medical and religious personnel. The first Geneva Convention protects wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. What does this first convention deals with? The first set of treaty deals with wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. Now, your people are quietly listening to me. Please tell me if you are able to understand these points or not, because these are not very complex things, a very simple thing and written in a very straightforwardly manner. Are you people getting me? Okay then. So the first Geneva Convention protects wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. This convention extends to medical and religious personnel, medical units and transport. Okay, medical units and transport, medical transport. So जितने भी लैंड वॉर में ज़मीन के ऊपर जितने भी सोल्जर्स बीमार पड़ जाएंगे या ज़ख्मी हो जाएंगे, ठीक है, जितने भी होंगे ज़ख्मी पड़ जाएंगे, जेनेवा कन्वेंशन की फर्स्ट ट्रीटी उनसे डील करती है. द फर्स्ट जेनेवा कन्वेंशन प्रोटेक्ट्स द वुंडेड and sick soldiers on land during war. This convention extends to medical and religious personnel. Okay, the first set of treaty extends to medical and religious personnel, medical units and medical transport, right? Medical units and medical transport, while recognizing distinctive emblems of these organizations. The convention has two annexes containing a draft agreement relating to hospital zones and a model identity card for medical and religious personnel. They are like, according to the two annexes of the convention and the draft agreement, containing the draft agreement relating to hospital zones and a model identity card, there is going to be given a model identity card for the medical and religious personnel, so that they may travel without any restraint. Okay, and hospital zones, how the hospital zones are to be established, what are the do's and don'ts in and around the hospital zones. Okay, now this convention, you must have got the first, you must have got an idea about the first treaty of the Geneva Convention, right? Have you got an idea about it? Okay, then the second Geneva Convention protects wounded, sick and shipwrecked military personnel at sea during war. The second Geneva Convention protects wounded, sick and shipwrecked military personnel at sea during war. The first Geneva Convention protects wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. Okay, on land during war. You can say that the first treaty of the Geneva Convention is terrestrial in nature because it protects wounded and sick soldiers on land during war, while the second Geneva Convention protects the wounded, sick and shipwrecked military personnel at sea during war. Okay, the second Geneva Convention is aquatic in nature because it protects wounded, sick and shipwrecked military personnel at sea during war. This convention also extends to hospital ships and medical transports by sea, with specific commentary on the treatment of and protections for their personnel. Okay, this convention also extends to hospital ships and medical transports by sea, with specific commentary on the treatment of and protections for their personnel. Okay, how the wounded, sick and shipwrecked military personnel at sea should be treated, what are the things that should be done with them, what are the directions, do's and don'ts for the hospital ships, for the medical transports by sea, and there's a specific commentary on the treatment of and protection of for their personnel, how you have to treat them, what are the medical aids that you should provide them immediately. The second Geneva Convention is, that's what I said, that the first one is terrestrial in nature, the second one is aquatic in nature. Because the first one protects the wounded and sick soldiers on land during war, the second Geneva Convention protects wounded, sick and shipwrecked military personnel at sea during war. Understood? Proplin says organization like International Red Cross Society provides these facilities to the wounded and the sick. That's right. That's absolutely right. But it has nothing to do with the Geneva Convention. Because Geneva Convention is not talking about any private organization, international organization. Geneva Convention is talking about, is bounding the nations. It's bounding the nations, the countries, the states to do these things. rather than binding any other private organization. It is binding the nations, it is binding the countries to do this, right? Now, the Third Geneva Convention applies to prisoners of war, including a wide range of general protections such as humane treatment, maintenance and equality across prisoners, conditions of captivity, questioning and evacuation of prisoners, transit camps, food, clothing, medicines, hygiene, and right to religious, intellectual, and physical activities of prisoners. Okay. So Mesh is asking that if I can discuss in brief the causes of Russia-Ukraine dispute and what actions can be taken by the United Nations, also why United Nations is unable to control the situation. Okay, and in the end of it I am going to discuss some points. Okay, so Mesh, the Third Geneva Convention applies to prisoners of war, including a wide range of general protections such as humane treatment, maintenance and equality across prisoners, conditions of captivity, questioning and evacuation of prisoners, transit camps, food, clothing, medicines, hygiene, right to religious, intellectual and physical activities of the prisoners. The Third Geneva Convention deals with POWs. That if, for example, any one country has arrested the armed forces personnel of the other rival nation and they've brought them on their land, so they'll be kept as POWs, the prisoners of war. So the Third Geneva Convention says that humane treatment should be provided to them. The nations, the authorities should put in their endeavors to maintain and for the maintenance and equality across the prisoners. And there are certain prescribed conditions for captivity. You cannot hold them captive, you cannot imprison them in unhygienic conditions, conditions which are not conducive for human inhabitation. There are conditions which should be very good. You cannot provide inhumane treatment by doing this. There are conditions of captivity which are there in the Third Geneva Convention. Questioning and evacuation of prisoners. How you have to interrogate them, how do you have to question them, how do you have to evacuate the prisoners. There will be transit camps, there will be food, there will be clothing, there will be medicines, hygiene and right to religious, intellectual and physical activities of prisoners. Prisoners should be allowed to resort to do intellectual activities, physical activities and any religious activities. If they want to offer namaz, you should give them proper opportunity, time and place. Okay, time and place to offer the namaz or to do puja or to visit a church or to visit a gurudwara. These are the kinds of things that the Third Geneva Convention applies to. The First Geneva Convention applies to the sick and wounded army personnel on land. The Second Geneva Convention applies to the sick and wounded army personnel and shipwrecked army personnel at sea during war. The Third Geneva Convention applies to the POWs, including wide range of general protections such as humane treatment, maintenance and equality across prisoners, conditions of captivity, questioning and evacuation of prisoners, transit camps, food, clothing, medicines, hygiene and right to religious, intellectual and physical activities of prisoners. Okay. The Fourth Geneva Convention, which most eminently applies to the invasion of Ukraine by Russian military forces, protects civilians, including those in occupied territory. Okay. The Fourth Geneva Convention, which most eminently applies to the invasion of Ukraine by Russian military forces, eminently applies to the invasion of Ukraine by Russian military forces. It protects civilians, including those in occupied territory. Okay, that is the fourth Geneva Convention. The fourth Geneva Convention is the most relevant convention today in the Russia-Ukraine war, because it applies to the civilians of the belligerent states. If the two states, if the two nations, if the two countries are fighting, what about the civilians of these countries? Why should they suffer? Isn't it? So this is the most relevant Geneva Convention in the Russia-Ukraine war today. We are talking about, the first convention is talking about the army personnel, the sick and wounded army personnel on land. The second Geneva Convention is also talking about the shipwrecked army personnel at sea during war. The third Geneva Convention is talking about the POWs. But the most important is the fourth Geneva Convention, which talks about the civilians of the belligerent states. And this eminently applies to the invasion of Ukraine by Russian military forces. That if Russian military forces, they are trying to invade the Ukraine, and they are trying to topple the government of the Zelensky in Ukraine, why would and why should civilians suffer? The question is this. Okay, protect civilians, including those in occupied territory. So it's about the civilians of the two nations. The other Geneva Conventions were concerned mainly with combatants rather than civilians. However, based on the experience of World War II, which demonstrated the horrific consequences of having no convention for the protection of civilians in wartime, the fourth convention, comprising 159 articles, outlines the norms for this critical dimension of conflict. Okay, this fourth convention has 159 articles, and it outlines the norms for dealing with civilians. Okay, the Second World War, which ended in 1944, it gave us the brutal, horrendous experiences of catastrophes unfolded by the Second World War. It demonstrated the horrific consequences of having a no convention. So the fourth convention, Geneva Convention, exclusively dealing with the protection of civilians, was incorporated into the Geneva Convention, having 159 articles outlining the norms for dealing with civilians. Because that's very important. Then comes, along with the additional protocols of 1977. Now, all these four conventions, all these four treaties, they came into being in 1949. But there are three additional protocols which were added to the Geneva Convention in 1977. The fourth convention expounds upon the general protection of populations against certain consequences of war, the conduct of hostilities, and the status and treatment of protected persons, distinguishing between the situation of foreigners on the territory of one of the parties to the conflict and that of civilians in occupied territory. This convention also spells out the obligations of the occupying power vis-a-vis the civilian population, and outlines detailed provisions on humanitarian relief for populations in occupied territory. Okay, so the additional protocols of 1977 added to the Geneva Convention, okay, they are also very important, because the fourth convention, as we discussed, it talks about the protection of population against certain consequences of war, the conduct of hostilities, and the status and treatment of protected persons, distinguishing between the situation of foreigners on the territory of one of the parties to the conflict and that of civilians in the occupied territory. Now, this convention also spells out the obligations of the occupying power vis-a-vis the civilian population. Now, for example, if Russia is trying to occupy the Ukrainian territory, what are the rights of the civilian population of Ukraine? And outlines detailed provisions on humanitarian relief for populations in occupied territory. Now, as the International Committee for the Red Cross, like Prablin said, now the name is here, as the International Committee for the Red Cross, a key medical intermediary in such situations. There is yet another organization, Doctors Sans Frontières. It's a French organization, Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders. It also works like International Committee for the Red Cross. Now, International Committee for the Red Cross, it's a key medical intermediary in such situations, explains that this convention also contains a specific regime for the treatment of civil internees, including 3 annexes on hospital and safety zones and model regulations on humanitarian relief. Okay, so you must have understood this. Now, which countries are signatories? The Geneva Conventions have been ratified by 196 states. The Geneva Conventions have been ratified by 196 states, including all UN member states. The 3 protocols have been ratified by 174, 169 and 79 states respectively. How many states have ratified the Geneva Convention so far? 196, including all the UN member states. Okay. Now I guess 190, the total membership of the United Nations is 193. And there are 3 other nations along with those who have ratified the Geneva Convention. The 3 protocols have been ratified by 174, 169 and 79 states respectively. That means the first protocol of 1977 ratified by 174 nations, the second protocol of 1977 ratified by 169 states, and the third protocol of 2005 ratified by 79 states. In 2019, perhaps anticipating the possibility of its invading Ukraine in the near future, Russia withdrew its declaration under Article 90 of Protocol 1, which states that the high contracting parties may at the time of signing, ratifying or acceding to the protocol or at any other subsequent time declare that they recognize ipso facto and without special agreement in relation to any other high contracting party accepting the same obligation, the competence of the International Fact-Finding Commission to inquire into allegations by such other party as authorized by this article. By withdrawing this declaration, Russia has preemptively left itself with the option to refuse access by any international fact-finding missions to Russian entities, individuals or resources that might potentially, in Moscow's reckoning, find Russia responsible for violations of the Geneva Convention's standards. Okay. So what did Russia do? Before invading Ukraine, Russia withdrew its declaration under Article 90 of the Protocol 1. Okay, because Article 90 of Protocol 1 mandated the ratifying state to give access to any international fact-finding commission which may be sent by the United Nations to inquire and investigate into the inhumane killings and crimes against humanity unfolded and resorted to by such belligerent country. So before this could happen, Russia withdrew its declaration under Article 90 so that it may refuse to grant any access to the International Fact-Finding Commission to inquire into allegations by such other party as authorized by this article. Had Russia not withdrawn itself from Article 90 of Protocol 1, it could never ever have been able to decline any access to the International Fact-Finding Commission, and the Commission could have got into the Russian territory and would have inquired into allegations by the Ukraine as authorized by the article. But this time, since Russia has already withdrawn from the Article 90 of Protocol 1 beforehand, now Russia is in a position to decline to give access to the International Fact-Finding Commission. Okay. Now by withdrawing this declaration, Russia has preemptively left itself with the option to refuse access by any international fact-finding missions to Russian entities, individuals, or resources that might potentially, in Moscow's reckoning, find Russia responsible for violations of the Geneva Conventions standards. Okay. Okay, then further, the four conventions and the first two protocols of the Geneva Conventions were ratified by the Soviet Union, not Russia. Now, Russia is a different country. The four conventions and the first two protocols of the Geneva Convention, they were ratified by the Soviet Union. It then happened to be the Soviet Union. And Russia came into being in 1991 after a split in the Soviet Union. Hence, there is a risk of the Russian government of the day disavowing any responsibility under the conventions in toto. Okay, so Russian government can shrug off any responsibility under the conventions, that we are not going to subjugate, we are not going to, make ourselves subordinate to any provision under the conventions, because we are not signatories. We have not ratified the convention. It was Soviet Union which recognized it. We did not do it. Okay. Then, what would be the steps for potential prosecution under the conventions? Under Article 8 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, it is the ICC that has jurisdiction in respect of war crimes, in particular, when committed as part of a plan or policy or as part of a large-scale commission of such crimes. Under the statute, war crimes refers to grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, including willful killing or torture or inhumane treatment, including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly, compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power, willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protected person of the rights of fair and regular trial, unlawful deportation or transfer of unlawful confinement, taking of hostages. So this is Article 8 of Rome Statute of the ICC, International Criminal Court. And this has jurisdiction, this has an exclusive jurisdiction to deal with war crimes, especially when these war crimes include all these things. And what are war crimes? What are war crimes? It's the willful killing, torture or inhumane treatment, biological experiments, causing great sufferings or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly, compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power, willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protected person of the rights of fair and regular trial, unlawful deportation or transfer or unlawful confinement, taking of hostages and the like. These are referred to as war crimes. And Article 8 of the Rome Statute of the ICC, it has exclusive jurisdiction to deal with this. Okay. The statute goes beyond these crimes directed against individuals to include within the definition of war crimes broader acts that occur within armed conflict, including intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities, such as attacking or bombarding towns, villages, dwellings or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives, and intentionally directing attacks against personnel, installations, material, units or vehicles involved in a humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping mission in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, especially when it is in the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects or widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. Okay. Now the statute goes beyond these crimes against individuals to include within the definition of war crimes broader acts that occur within the armed conflict. The broader acts, not specifically war crimes. The statute, the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court, it also talks about the broader acts, not just specifically war crimes, but any act which is connected therewith in anyhow. Okay, and these include all these things. If you are attacking undefended establishments, dwellings, villages, you are bombarding towns, you are attacking installations, materials, units, vehicles, or involved in a humanitarian assistance, then you will be brought to books. Okay. Russia was a part of Soviet Union, Somesh. It was one union. But Russia says we have a different identity now. We are a separate identity now. And we as Russia should sign the convention. Our ratification should not be mingled with the ratification of the Soviet Union. Okay. Then what evidence of war crimes has been accumulated so far? Speaking in Poland, US Vice President Kamala Harris called for an investigation into allegations of Russia committing war crimes in Ukraine, citing as example the bombing of a maternity hospital in the southern city of Mariupol, including scenes of bloodied pregnant women being evacuated. Similarly, there has been photographic and video evidence of lethal fighting on civilians trying to escape across a damaged bridge in Irpin near Kyiv, and hours of cell phone videos of bombed out schools, houses and apartments building across Ukraine. So that's what Kamala Harris has called for an investigation, and there are videographic and photographic evidences. However, analysts have argued that much of such evidence, while corroborating the allegation of attack on non-combatants and civilian infrastructure, does not answer the central question of any war crime prosecution: who ordered which crime. The evidence that is required to answer this question, if it is recoverable, will come from the mobile phones and other communications equipment of Russian soldiers, which would typically include information on orders received from commanding officers and video or audio evidence of attacks executed and the aftermath. To examine any such evidence emerging on February 28, the ICC opened a war crimes investigation under its prosecutor Karim Khan. Okay, now to what extent have the Geneva Conventions been upheld worldwide in recent years? On the 70th anniversary of the Convention's adoption, Amnesty International, a human rights advocacy group, noted in 2019 that there has been a blatant disregard for civilian protection and international humanitarian law in armed conflicts where 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are parties: Russia, US, UK, and France. Specifically, so Amnesty International said that these countries who are the permanent members of the Security Council, they give a blatant disregard for civilian protection and international humanitarian law in armed conflicts. And that's what I told you, that United States, while policing in Afghanistan, it had blatant disregard for the civilian protection. It had blatant disregard for civilian population in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan and Yemen. And that's what they do every time. So specifically, Amnesty cited the US-led coalition's bombing of Raqqa in Syria, which left more than 1,600 civilians dead, destruction of civilian infrastructure and lives in Aleppo and Idlib by Russian forces, leading to mass displacement of millions, and the war in Yemen, where the Saudi Arabia and the UAE-led coalition backed by the West killed and injured thousands of civilians, fueling a full-blown humanitarian crisis. Now, these cases underscore the grim fact that the Geneva Conventions, even when backed by the rulings of the ICC, cannot be enforced by third parties to any conflict. However, they have in the past proved effective at raising global awareness of human rights violations across conflict zones, and in some cases led to sanctions or trade embargoes against the belligerents. Okay, so that's how the things goes. Like, they have a blatant disregard for the civilian population. Okay, human rights violations की awareness बढ़ानी है last में, and in some cases led to sanctions or trade embargoes against the belligerents. Now, as Sumesh asked me, that what are the brief reasons for the Russia-Ukraine war. See, there were 2 blocks, the Soviet bloc and the US bloc. Okay, in the post-Cold War era, what did we see? There were 2 major blocks, and all the other countries of the world, they had to align themselves with either of the blocks. It was then when Jawaharlal Nehru, along with Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and many others, they started non-aligned movement, that they are not going to align themselves with either of the blocs. They are sovereign nations. Their terms, their terms with any country would be guided and would be driven by their own interest, by their own foreign policy, sovereign foreign policy, and they are not going to align themselves with either of the blocs. But these blocs existed, and this was the post Second World War era, which this era ushered into a Cold War. Okay, now this Cold War era had two blocs. Now after the Second World War, the military alliance was formed by United States against the Russia. This military alliance called North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed. Okay, it's an intergovernmental military organization. All the member nations of the NATO have contributed their forces in the NATO. This was established against the ideology of the Soviet Union and to fight against the Soviet Union's incursions. The Soviet Union, in response to this, formed the Warsaw Pact. Okay, now today, any country who wishes to join the NATO, like the Ukraine, which was earlier a part of Soviet Union, was now was now trying to join the NATO, and this perturbed and pestered Russia, and this prompted Russia to gain control of the entire territory of Ukraine. What happened in 2014? Russia gained the control of Crimea. Okay, it was annexed, and this time Ukraine is being annexed. Okay, Ukraine is being annexed. It is being acquired. So what lies at the center of the conflict is the annexation of territory, and second, that any country, especially the countries who earlier were a part of the erstwhile USSR, cannot now join the NATO. Okay, cannot now join the NATO, and Russia was trying to invade Ukraine because of this. Okay, now you were asking, Somesh, that why United Nations is not taking any action. Did United Nations take any action on whatever happened in Yemen, Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan? Did United Nations take any action to the persecutions against the persecutions of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar? Is United Nations doing enough for the protection of Buddhist and Hindu minorities in Bangladesh? They are being persecuted. Is United Nations doing enough to protect the Muslims in Xinjiang province in China? Now tell me, if you look at the record of the United Nations, what can you expect of it? And what should you rather expect of it? Okay, United Nations can only pass resolutions. It can pass sanctions. And all these resolutions and all these major decisions are taken by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, who actually the problem creators in the entire world. They write their own destiny by their own hands while sitting in the United Nations Security Council. They enjoy the power of the veto. I told you yesterday. Isn't it? So that's all about it. If you have any question, anything to ask, please go ahead. That means no action can be taken against Russia, Somesh is asking. It's not that no action can be taken against Russia. I'm just saying that action, even if an action can be taken against Russia, can you send Vladimir Putin to jail? You know, these things are not practically possible. Whatever is happening today in Ukraine, that happened in 2015 in Nigeria. That Buhari, dictator Buhari, named Buhari of Nigeria, has not been yet brought to books. It is only the domestic legislations of these countries that can bring such people to books. Okay, action can be taken, provided that the United Nations is not reluctant to take action. It should be willing to take the action. Okay. So no questions, I guess. Okay, then I'm ending the live stream now, and let's meet the next week. Okay, bye bye.